Good morning. Oh, hello, everyone. Good morning to the Great Hall here at Calvary Church, and good morning to those who are joining us online from wherever you might be this morning. My name is Catherine Bush. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Education here at Calvary Church, and it's a pleasure to be with you however you are joining us this morning. Today is a beautiful day to gather. And it's a wonderful day at Calvary because we're here to welcome David Waters. David worked for the Commercial Appeal for 35 years as a religion and education reporter, columnist, and editorial page editor. He left Memphis for a little bit. From 2007 to 2010, he served as the religion editor for the Washington Post and launched, wrote, edited, and produced its On Faith website and Under God blog. His numerous state and national journalism awards include a Distinguished Writing Award from the American Society of Newspaper Editors, 5 Wilbur Awards from the Religion Communications Council, and induction into the Scripps Howard Editorial Hall of Fame. He's a 1981 graduate of the University of Memphis and received the Outstanding Journalism Alumni Award from the university in 2009. These days, David serves at the Institute for Public Service Reporting. That's a professional newsroom specializing in in-depth, investigative, and explanatory journalism. It's filling a void where legacy media has scaled back and/or eliminated essential coverage of key community issues. On a personal note, when I graduated from seminary in 2003, I was instructed to find a mentor. And I'm pretty sure that they meant a priest. I picked David, and he met with me off and on at the Deliberate Literate, remember that coffee shop on Union? For 3 years of my ministry, offering me encouragement and guidance and nudging me to expand myself, my mind, and my heart. My heart may not be as large as his is. I may never get there, but it's bigger and stronger because of him. We're very glad that he and Robin have power and that he's with us this week and that he's here with us to tell us about the news. Please welcome David Waters.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you all hear me okay? Hello on Zoom. Some of us are boomers, but all of us are Zoomers now, right? So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to read what I have to say because I have a lot to say and I didn't want to forget something. And, as you know, some of you may know, the older you get, the more you forget. So, hi, I'm David, and I'm a newsaholic. When I was a kid, while other kids were running out to play after school, I was rushing to the door to get the afternoon newspaper. Anybody remember afternoon newspapers? Okay. Anybody remember newspapers? While other kids were watching reruns of Hogan's Heroes and Gilligan's Island, I was watching the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. In high school, while my peers were studying or partying, I was making a daily date with Senator Sam Ervin in the Watergate hearings. In college, I wrote for the campus newspaper and the campus magazine, while I worked full-time at the Commercial Appeal. As a young journalist, I was the news editor at the CA. My job was to monitor all the wire services that provided the news from across the country and around the world. When big news happened, I generally was the first person in Memphis and one of the first people anywhere to find out. I felt like I was sitting in the cockpit of a massive spaceship looking over the entire planet, keenly aware of what was happening in the world. For most people, news is a noun. For me, it's always been a verb. It's something I've done for decades. I've spent my entire adult life in news. I've worked as a news reporter, a news columnist, a news editor, and a news junkie. I began to notice I might have a problem way back in the 1990s. I was on vacation with my family when news broke that a fleet of police cars was chasing O.J. Simpson in a white Ford Bronco on a California highway. I knew it was a big story, and I was immediately relieved that I didn't have to do a thing about it. I didn't have to remake the front page or come up with a local angle to the story or call anyone for a reaction. I didn't even have to watch it unfold on TV. I could just go about my life as if it wasn't happening. What a relief that was. It didn't last. A few days later, I went back to work at the daily newspaper and continued to ignore my problem. It only got worse. As the years and the news rolled on, it became easier and easier to feed my habit. News talk radio, 24/7 cable news, the internet, the World Wide Web, Google, Facebook, Twitter, the smartphone, a news junkie's best friend. The year the iPhone was introduced, I got a job at the Washington Post. For a news junkie, moving from the CA to the Post was like moving from marijuana to cocaine. Washington is the center of the news universe. Nearly everyone I met was either making news or covering it. The competition to do one or the other, or both, was fierce and intoxicating. I loved every minute of it. Deep down, I knew that had to change. My first step was to admit I had a problem, and that problem wasn't going to get any better if I kept mainlining the news. Working in DC for the Post was my dream job, but it wasn't my dream life. That was back in Memphis, the center of a much smaller news universe. We came back to Memphis in 2010 for a lot of reasons. Most of them had to do with our family and friends and faith community here. But we also wanted to disconnect from the news frenzy that is Washington. It was too late. The news had already been nationalized. Maybe it was Trump's election or Obama's election. Maybe it was 9/11. On some level, national news has always mattered, no matter where you live. But at some point in recent history, the national news, and primarily national partisan political news, began taking over all our lives, politicizing every aspect of our life, further and further polarizing us. The nationalized, politicized, polarized news divides us into red and blue, black, white, and brown, southern, midwestern, and coastal, climate change believers and climate change deniers, cancel culture warriors and cancel culture rebels, racists and anti-racists, Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, maskers and anti-maskers, vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, insurrectionists and patriots, real news believers and fake news believers. There are a lot of reasons why this explosion of news has happened. The end of the fairness doctrine in the 1980s, the deregulation of media ownership and telecommunications businesses in the 1990s, the shift in news media ownership from local Main Street to Wall Street, the rise of talk radio and 24/7 cable, which turned the news into a form of nonstop entertainment, the blurring and then erasing of the line between news and commentary, between fact and opinion, between information and disinformation, the decline of local news, especially local newspapers, and most consequential, I think, the internet and the rise of new media, especially social media. When 9/11 happened, I remember this was only 20 years ago, more than half of Americans said they got their daily news from local print newspapers, and about 10% got their news online. Today, those numbers have more than flipped. Today, only about 10% of Americans get their news from print. Nearly 90% of Americans get their news online with a smartphone, a computer, or a tablet. And more than half of us get our news from Google, Facebook, search engines, or social media sites. New media has had a profound impact on the production and distribution of news. The business model for online companies doesn't depend on paid customers, but rather engaging users. Think about that. They don't depend on paid customers, but engaged users. Content that prompts some sort of reaction, a click, a like, a comment, a share, tends to generate more clicks and shares and ad revenue. That high response content is what social media algorithms tend to promote. News stories about scandals, murders, insults, conspiracy theories tend to draw a lot more clicks. Those stories trend, rising to the top of sites and search engines and social media platforms, and feed on themselves. That digital sorting of the news has led to another big change. The internet traffics in confirmation bias. The more search and social companies know about us, the better they get at serving us content and ads we like or agree with and click on. And the better they get at filtering out content and ads we generally don't like or agree with or click on. In other words, new media algorithms steer us toward news and information that reflects our own personal, political, and ideological preferences, and away from those that don't. If you click or like or share posts that promote COVID vaccines and masking, you're more likely to see posts like that. If you click or like or share posts that say COVID is a hoax, or vaccines are dangerous, or a form of government intrusion, you're more likely to see posts like that. That leads to increasing political and social separation and polarization. And that brings us to a third big change. The internet traffics in disinformation. Disinformation is intentional, false, or inaccurate information aimed at achieving a social or political goal. Social media algorithms not only reward popular posts, they also reward disinformation. Lies tend to go more viral, more quickly than true statements. So do conspiracy theories, distortions, and exaggerations. Suzanne Nossel, who's the CEO of PEN, P-E-N, which is the world's leading advocacy group for open expression, recently said, rampant disinformation imperils the values and civic benefits that the First Amendment is intended to uphold. So even though disinformation is constitutionally protected, the fate of free speech and open discourse, and maybe even democracy itself, hinges on our ability to get it under control. So how do we do that? It's doubtful we can rely on social media companies or big tech or Congress or Russia to get rampant disinformation under control. They all benefit too much from it. We're going to have to do this ourselves, not just as individuals, but as we, the people. I think we have to start by getting our own news consumption under control. The problem with a news addiction isn't just that they keep adding fentanyl to the heroin or cocaine. The problem is substance abuse and addiction itself. The problem isn't just news disinformation. I think the problem is news inundation. It's not just a question of what we do with all this news. What does all this news do to us? Number one, news creates its own narrative. By nature, news is generally bad. You don't come home and say, honey, I just saw a guy walking across the street and he didn't get hit by a car. Or honey, your mom called, your grandfather didn't suffer a stroke today. The more news you watch or hear or read, the worse things get. The news should keep us informed, but it's more likely to tell us what's going wrong and very little about what's going right. And that's a distorted and generally negative presentation of reality. Number two, news creates its own reality. Fox gives us one reality, CNN another. In one, Obama is ushering in change for good, and the other, Obama is luring us into change for evil. In one, Trump is making America great again, and another, Trump is destroying America. That's true not just on cable. The New York Times gives us one reality, the Wall Street Journal another. Local TV news gives us one reality, commercial appeal, and the Daily Memphian give us others. Our Facebook pages give us one reality or another, depending on what page you're looking at. Algorithms and bad foreign actors give us distorted and entirely fabricated realities. On some level, there's always been competing versions of the news. Now those versions are beamed directly and incessantly into our living rooms and into our pockets. Which brings me to the third change. News is overwhelming. Even for a lifelong newsman, and even for a newsman working at the center of a small news universe like Memphis, when I was younger, I started sipping news from a cup. Then I started guzzling it from a pitcher. At some point, the pitcher became a garden hose, then a fire hose. At times, I feel like I am drowning in the news. The more news I try to consume, the angrier and more politicized and polarized I feel. It doesn't just affect my professional life, it also disrupts my personal life. I become more suspicious and judgmental, more inclined to question someone else's politics, patriotism, intelligence, integrity, humanity. I become more wary of spending time with family and friends and neighbors. How many of us are having to decide what you can and cannot talk about with extended family and friends? How many of us have stopped spending time with certain family and friends because of their political views? How many of us are just tired of talking about the news? Frankly, I am. There's too much news and not enough information. There are too many people talking about the news and commenting on the news and getting angry about the news. There are not enough trained professional journalists being given the time, space, and training to help us understand the news and make sense of it. We don't need more news, we need more context. We don't need more instant reaction and anger. We need more reflection and explanation. We like to say that journalism is the first rough draft of history. In most cases, the news is a quick summary of that first rough draft. It's a mile wide and an inch deep. Most news reports can tell you what happened, but most news reporters don't have the time, the space, the supervision, or the ability to tell you how or why. That's not why I left the commercial appeal. The company that owns the CA offered longtime employees a generous buyout, and I couldn't refuse it. But that is why I joined the Institute for Public Service Reporting at the University of Memphis. The Institute gives me the time, the space, and the mission to understand and explain the news and to offer context. I don't have to react to the news. I can reflect on the news. I don't report the news, I try to explain it. It's such a relief. Now, I'm not in a position where I can ignore the news. I don't think any of us are. We can and should stay informed. Our democracy depends on it, more than ever probably. But we can't stay informed without being inundated. I haven't watched cable TV news in years. Now, America doesn't seem like the most divided and divisive place on the planet. I cut the cord with cable years ago, so I also don't watch local TV news. Now, Memphis doesn't seem like the most dangerous place on the planet. I'm not on Twitter. I look at Facebook once or twice a week, and I never scroll down the feed. I never, ever read comments on news sites, especially my own stories. Now the world doesn't seem quite as mean-spirited or hard-hearted or just plain crazy. I still subscribe to 7 newspapers, 4 news magazines, and several news emails. And they're all right here in my pocket, being updated constantly, beseeching me to take another hit. I haven't stopped reading the news, but I'm reading less and less of it. I have stopped reading editorial pages, even though I spent years working as a columnist and an editorial page editor. I want journalists to explore and explain the news, not comment on it. So why am I talking about this in church? Karl Barth said, we should hold a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. I'm not sure how we'd feel about changing that newspaper for a smartphone, but that's where we are. And I think his larger point holds. Our world informs our faith, and our faith should inform our world. People of faith should be talking about the news, what we should do with all of it, and what it is doing to all of us. So let's talk about the news. Anybody want to talk about the news?
Hi, I had a question. In terms of how news is paid for, do you think that that's had an effect on the content you receive? Whereas before you used to have classified ads and actual ads taken out in a newspaper, whereas now the content is pushed online, it's largely available free, and the way the content is paid for is by clicks in advertisers.
Yeah, it's completely transformed the news media business. Like I said earlier, you used to care about who paid for the news, so we would count how many people subscribed to the newspaper, and that's how we generated ads and ad revenue to pay our salaries and to pay for the business. I think it was about 75, 80%, Leanne can correct me, at one point, classified ads covered about 75 or 80% of the newspaper's revenue. And then when Craigslist came along and the internet came along and autotrader.com came along and all of the help wanted ads went away and all the classifieds went away. So almost overnight, newspapers lost about 70% of their income. And then retail ads started going away too, because car dealers and grocery stores and other big display ad folks started finding other ways to advertise and get to customers, mostly through digital means. Now, another big thing that happened was that when you went from print ads and print to digital, you can't charge as much for a digital ad. So for every dollar you could charge for a paid ad in the newspaper, you could only charge about a dime for the similar ad on digital. So you went from $1 to a dime. That's a 90% drop in advertising also. Another big change was back in the 80s, started 80s and 90s, when a lot of newspapers, including the Commercial Appeal, started moving from privately held companies, mostly local companies, although the CA was owned by a chain. It was still a privately held company. And then they went public. And when you go public, you get a lot of capital infusion, and so we started spending money like crazy. At the same time that we started spending all this money on new staff, and they sent me all over the world. And it was great. They sent Jeff Calkins to every Olympics. I mean, it was just great. We were rolling in the dough, but somebody didn't realize that at the same time that our spending was going up, our circulation was going down. In 1990, it started going down. Well, that's because of the internet. And for a while, all the content on the internet was free. And we were charging people. And so you had this, it just couldn't last. You had expenditures going up and revenue going down. And that's when, in 2000, everybody started cutting. And another thing about Wall Street is, they demand, stockholders want quarterly earnings. They want growth. If you're not growing on Wall Street, you're dying. So at the same time that Wall Street was demanding growth, newspapers were in decline. So it was this death spiral that we were in. And that's one of the reasons that everything shifted to the internet. It just made economic sense. So the the old business model went away. So yeah, it changed. Not only did it change our staffing, we went from like 200 journalists at the Commercial Appeal in the 1990s. I think they maybe have 25 now, 30. And it's not like Memphis shrunk. So instead of having 200 people cover this area, you have 25 at the Daily Memphian, you have 25 at the Commercial Appeal, and you have another 10 or so at various places like MLK 50, the Institute for Public Service Reporting, Chalkbeat, and so on. So you have many, many fewer reporters covering the news. So just think about that for a minute. If you're a state legislator or a governor, and back in the 90s, you knew there were 25 or 30 full-time reporters covering your every move in Nashville. And now you might have 3 or 4. You know that nobody's paying attention. Nobody's keeping an eye on what you're doing. And so you can start, for example, paying people to vote for vouchers. It's completely shifted everything. And so I think that one of the reasons, and you mentioned this, sort of one of the reasons about why the content has changed is because clicks matter now. The more clicks you get on a website, and the other thing about internet is they can measure everything now. In the old days, we could measure how many people bought the paper. And we had this metric called readership. We could sort of calculate if we sold 100,000 papers, maybe there was 2.5 people reading every edition of the paper, families and such, offices. So maybe we had a readership of 250,000, which was not bad. Now they can measure not only how many people are clicking on your site, but they can measure how many people are clicking on a particular headline, how long they're staying on the story, how far down they're scrolling on the story, if they click from the story to something else, if they click from the story page where the ad is to the ad. They measure everything. And so you are now, as a business, you're sort of caught in this trap where you have to generate clicks. And, you know, journalists try not to write what they call clickbait. But it's hard not to do that because you want people clicking. And they measure every week and every month who's clicking on what, and they tell you. And that's one of the wonderful things about not working at paper anymore is I don't have to worry about that. I never pay attention to clicks or anything like that, so it's great. But it has changed not only how many people are covering the news and where they're covering, but it's changing what we're covering too.
So
Yep.
That's so interesting that your comment about there's actually less coverage of, say, an individual legislator, because the perception is that with the rise of social media, a person can't move hand or foot without the whole world knowing every little detail of your
Right.
life. Can you kind of
Yeah,
comment on
that's
that?
a really good point. In some ways, we're getting more and more attention than we've ever gotten. You can't go anywhere without somebody having a phone, and if you do something stupid or say something stupid, I mean, there may be somebody in this room right now who's taking a picture of me saying something stupid, and it's going to be on Facebook, and I'll never see it anyway. But yeah, so think about the mindset of a politician who has to deal with social media, but not have to deal with sort of traditional media. So how is that going to change how you think, what you do, what you say, where you go? I can't imagine how difficult it is in some ways to be a politician these days because you know every slip-up is going to somehow wind up on YouTube. It's got to be awful. But what kind of accountability is that? I mean, that's accountability for being stupid or being insensitive, but it's not necessarily accountability for not taking money from lobbyists, right? There's no way to take a quick YouTube video of that unless you happen to be in the hotel room when it happens. So I do think it's a completely different form of accountability, and in some ways it's a very artificial, superficial form of accountability that really, in the long run, doesn't matter. And in fact, I think it adds to not the disinformation so much as sort of our cynicism, our public cynicism about what politicians are doing or what celebrities are doing, because we all just see the sort of worst sides of people now, and we get more and more cynical, and I think that just sort of feeds into the polarization, and well, they're all crooks, they're all crazy, what can you do? Yep.
I can understand that you've probably lowered your blood pressure, but I'm wondering now what your conversations are like with family and friends.
It's really tough. You know, we have, my wife has 2 brothers in Georgia, and they're wonderful men. They're not 2 men I respect more in the world than those 2 guys, but they're conservative folks, and they have different views of things, different views of economics, different views of politics, different views of vaccination, for example. And so we have just decided when we see them that we're just not talking about it. It's really hard because you sort of have to be on guard all the time. You don't want to go down that road. And there's several relationships in my wife's life that we have sort of let go of because some folks just won't not talk about it. And that's one of the things that really has fascinated me and annoyed me is there just seem to be some folks who just have to talk about this stuff. They have to talk about politicians, or they have to talk about the vaccine issue. It's just so important to them. And that's why I was talking about the nationalization of the news. I think that has been one of the repercussions of this loss of local news, especially local journalism, is that we now have more and more national news that's beamed into our pockets. So we're more and more aware of and sensitive to what's happening nationally. Meanwhile, locally, I think we're much less informed and much less aware, except when crime happens, or except when somebody does something wrong. On the other hand, I will say this about social media, and we all know this is true. There is a form of accountability that social media has helped us with, and that is that, you go to places like Iran, Iraq, Syria, anywhere in the world, and there are people who are getting news and information out about what's really happening in those societies through social media. Same thing here with Black Lives Matter and other big issues in this country, immigration. So much of what's happening, of the reality that's happening in our world, we would not be aware of if not for social media, because there'd be oppressive governments or there'd be big tech companies or whatever would keep us from getting that information. And just the general loss of journalism in general. We've gone from 200 to 20, you're just not going to get as much information. So I do think there's a place for social media. I think there's a value in social media. But, it's like every other form of technology. It's a blessing and a curse at the same time.
Hi.
Hi.
I know you mentioned you subscribe to a few news publications and newsletters. I'm wondering if you have anything more to say about how you stay connected without falling into either inundation or tribalism.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a challenge every day. I feel like, I subscribe to the Daily Memphian and the Commercial Appeal. I really think it's important that we all stay connected to those two organizations in particular, because they are doing the most serious journalism in Memphis, and they're really trying to help us understand what's happening, especially with government, and I think that's vital. Could they do more? Sure, we could all do more, but they're trying, and it's important. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal every day. In some ways, I read all of them just to see what the different forms of reality are happening out there. I mean, it's just funny to me. You'll read a story in the New York Times about what's happening on Wall Street or what's happening in Washington, and then you'll read the same story in the Wall Street Journal, and it's like, what? This doesn't equate. They're not the same thing. But I do think that it's important for all of us, because we have these social media algorithms that sort of funnel our own beliefs back to us and reflect our own lives and views back to us. It's important for us to be intentional about trying to find other sources of information. So if you're liberal, find conservative. If you're conservative, find liberal, just to get a sort of sense of the different perspectives on the news. And when you see that there are different perspectives and different ways of presenting the same stories, that should at least make you think, well, maybe this isn't entirely true, and maybe this isn't entirely true, and maybe I need to do a little more research and find out what's really happening. So I do try to sort of maintain a general sense about what's going on in the world by reading news stories. I also read the New Yorker, which I love, and I think it's the best, in some ways, the best journalism we've got. But I also, like I said, I stopped reading editorial pages. I used to love reading columnists. I've always loved reading columnists. I grew up wanting to be a columnist. But honestly, I think for the most part, and I fell into this trap too when I was a columnist, I think I just added to, I did too much to add to the noise. When you're a columnist, you often have to choose sides. And I think that just adds to the divisiveness. I really do. And so whether it's a David Brooks opinion or whoever, I value their insight and perspective, but it's their insight and perspective. And it's not really what I need. What I need is more information so I can understand more fully what's happening. So I only look at news stories, and I don't look at every news story. I look at the headline, and one story I always avoid is the speculative story. And you see this all the time. I mean, even the greatest newspapers in the world do speculation stories all the time. What might happen? Are we close to another civil war? Well, maybe. I mean, nobody knows. So all you're doing is speculating. And I think that raises our anxiety levels, and that raises the divisiveness. And I just don't think it's necessary. I want you to tell me what's really happening now, not what might happen down the road. So I tend to avoid those kinds of stories. Mostly I'm just looking for information.
Can you talk a little bit about what it means to have the Bible in your other hand when you're reading all these things?
Funny you should ask. I have some homework for y'all. You don't have to do it, obviously, but I've been trying to do this. My wife and I are in Bible study every Wednesday night, and we've been going over the Sermon on the Mount. Not quite line by line, but, we take a little tiny section every week. And it's just stunning. I mean, it really is stunning. I think we have become so used to hearing parts of the Sermon on the Mount that we forget that it's 3 full chapters. And it's obviously only the longest sermon Jesus ever gave. I mean, otherwise he was just going around helping people and telling stories. But this was his sermon, right? He's standing up telling you, this is what I think, this is what I want, this is who you should be. And I don't think we pay enough attention to it. So what I would ask is to think about, just read the Sermon on the Mount this week. And just think about the things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about anger and insults and name-calling. And he talks about neighbors and enemies and accusers. He talks about worry and fear and retaliation. He talks about judging others and doing unto others. He talks about being hearers and doers, not serving 2 masters, being salt and light, and being blessings. And the Beatitudes, I think you could study the Beatitudes for the rest of your life and still get something new out of it every time you did it. We were talking about blessed are the peacemakers not long ago. We took one Beatitude at a time week by week, and it was great. And we talked about how the word peace in Hebrew is shalom, and how the Hebrew Judaic understanding of shalom is so much different than our current modern understanding of the word peace. And the rabbis would say that shalom was not just the absence of war and not just the presence of peace or tranquility. Shalom signifies a moral value and a goal. Overcoming of strife, quarrel, social tension, prevention of enmity. Now think about that in our current context. Overcoming of strife, quarrel, social tension, prevention of enmity. The pursuit of shalom, according to the rabbis, is an obligation and an opportunity. So imagine if the Constitution had been written to say, among our unalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of shalom, instead of just happiness. So what I'd ask you to do is read that sermon, and then think about that sermon as you're reading and listening and watching to the news. And think about shalom and the pursuit of shalom, and see in the news, or who in the news, and who, not only who is in the news, but who is giving you the news. Are they shalom makers or shalom breakers? I think it's just a different kind of lens to look at the news that we are inundated with and what it's doing to us. Is it helping us make shalom or break shalom? And then the second thing I'd ask you to do, I try to do this, I'm often successful, not always, is we all are told to observe the Sabbath, keep it holy, so let's have a news Sabbath once a week. I try to do a whole day. I try to do Sunday. Try not to look at this thing at all, and I try not to look at any news at all, unless I absolutely have to for work. But just give it a try. I mean, maybe you already do it. Just pick a day, or even pick half a day, and just don't look at any news. Don't watch it. Spend a whole week, if you want, not watching cable news, or local TV news, or reading the newspaper. Just try it. And see how you feel, if you feel any differently. Now, maybe it won't change your life after 1 week. But I do think that is one of the points of observing the Sabbath, is to pull back from the culture, pull back from all the madness, and to be reminded who we are and whose we are. And it's just almost impossible, at least for me it is, to do that when you're just inundated with this news all the time. So I'd ask you to read the sermon, look at the news, and listen to the news with the idea of looking for shalom makers and shalom breakers, and then just observe a news Sabbath sometime this week, and then we'll talk about it next week.
And the good news is that he's going to be back next week. So we're looking forward to it, and we thank you so, so much for the start of this
Thank you all
conversation.
very much.
And looking forward to part 2. Thank you so much. Thanks.